My feet pounded the cracked sidewalks of Portland's outer edges, my breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. The streetlights flickered above me, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist like grasping hands. I checked my phone again. Dead. Just my luck. In this part of town, everything went dark after 9 p.m., and the only sounds were the distant hum of cars on the freeway and the soft whisper of the wind. I had stayed late at work again, caught up in a last-minute project for a new client. Being new in town, I tried hard to impress my boss, but now, all I could think about was getting home to my tiny apartment, locking the door, and sleeping off the exhaustion. That's when I heard it, a faint scuff of shoes on the pavement behind me. I glanced over my shoulder, trying to be subtle. Nothing, just an empty street, the occasional rustle of leaves in the gutter. But my instincts told me otherwise. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding harder in my chest. Then, the footsteps came again. Closer this time, faster. I didn't dare look back. I broke into a run, my shoes slapping against the pavement. The alley ahead was my best bet, a shortcut that would take me straight to my apartment complex. I sprinted into the darkness, the world narrowing into a tunnel of shadows and fear. But halfway down the alley, something hard struck the back of my head. A flash of pain, then darkness swallowed me whole. I woke to the smell of damp concrete and the taste of copper in my mouth. My head throbbed, and my vision swam as I tried to piece together where I was. Cold metal dug into my wrists, and as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I realized I was sitting in a chair, my hands bound behind me. Hey, wake up." The voice was low and urgent, coming from somewhere nearby. I blinked, trying to focus, and found myself staring into the wide, fearful eyes of a man about my age. His face was smeared with dirt, and his clothes were torn. Behind him, a girl with dark hair watched me with a wary expression. "Welcome to hell," the man muttered. "And whatever you do, follow the damn rules." The world around me was spinning, the pain in my head like a dull, relentless hammer. I blinked rapidly, trying to focus as the fog in my mind cleared. The dim light flickered weakly, casting harsh shadows on the cracked walls. It took a moment for my surroundings to come into focus. A concrete room, small and claustrophobic, with walls that looked like they were stained with decades of grime. As I shifted in the chair, my wrists burned. I was bound tight with coarse rope, and every movement sent fresh spikes of pain up my arms. My breath came in shallow gasps as I struggled to remember how I had gotten here. I could still hear the echoes of those footsteps, feel the sudden, crushing pain in my skull. "You're awake," a voice said, snapping me back to reality. I jerked my head up, wincing at the pain that shot through my skull. A young man was standing across the room, leaning against the wall. His dirty blonde hair hung in tangled strands around his face, his eyes hollow and wary. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. Beside him, a girl with dark hair, her eyes wide and frightened, watched me with a guarded expression. Where am I?" I croaked, my voice rough. The man pushed himself off the wall and crouched in front of me. "We don't know exactly," he said, his voice a harsh whisper. "But you're stuck here, just like us." I glanced between the two of them, trying to make sense of it all. The girl spoke up, her voice shaky. "I'm Sarah, and this is Ryan. We've been here a while." Ryan nodded. "I don't know how long. Time doesn't mean much here." His eyes darted to the dark corners of the room, as if he expected something to emerge from the shadows. I tried to swallow, but my throat was painfully dry. Who did this? Why are we here?" Ryan hesitated, exchanging a quick glance with Sarah. She shook her head, as if urging him not to say more, but he sighed and reached into his pocket. He pulled out a folded piece of paper and thrust it toward me. "Read this," he said, his voice low. "And remember it. It's the only way you'll survive." I fumbled to unfold the paper with my bound hands, my eyes scanning the list of rules written in jagged, shaky handwriting. As I read, my heart sank. The rules: 1. Never scream. 2. Always be in your assigned room by midnight. 3. Do not speak to the masked man unless spoken to. 4. Never touch the door with the red mark. 5. If you hear music playing, close your eyes immediately. "What is this?" I whispered, my voice shaking. "Is this some kind of sick joke?" Ryan's expression hardened. "I wish it were. But trust me, these rules are real. Break them," and he trailed off, his face going pale. "They aren't just rules," Sarah added, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're more like survival tips." I stared down at the paper, my fingers trembling. "What happens if you break one?" Ryan's jaw clenched, and he looked away. "You don't want to find out," he said darkly. "We've seen what happens. It's not something you want to experience." Before I could ask more, a loud thunk echoed from somewhere above us, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps. Ryan and Sarah immediately stiffened, their eyes wide with fear. Sarah grabbed my arm, squeezing it hard. "Be quiet," she hissed. "He's coming." The footsteps grew louder, each one a deliberate, ominous thud that sent a chill racing down my spine. My heart pounded as I strained to see through the dim light. Then, the door at the far end of the room creaked open, and a figure stepped into the doorway. He was tall, impossibly tall, his shoulders broad and his presence filling the entire frame of the door. But it was the mask that sent icy fear coursing through my veins. It was smooth and featureless, reflecting the dim light like a blank, inhuman face. The masked man didn't speak. He simply stood there, watching us, his head tilting slightly as if examining his prey. Ryan and Sarah kept their heads bowed, their bodies tense. I followed their lead, keeping my eyes on the floor, my breath shallow and quick. "Emily," a voice whispered beside me. Ryan's voice, urgent and low. "Do not look at him. Do not speak to him. If he addresses you, just nod. Do whatever he says." I wanted to scream, to demand answers, to beg for release. But my instincts told me that doing so would be a mistake. I stayed still, my heart hammering in my chest, waiting for the masked man to make his move. After a long, agonizing moment, he turned and walked away, his footsteps fading into the distance. The door creaked shut behind him, and the silence that followed was almost deafening. Ryan let out a long breath, his shoulders sagging with relief. That was close. I turned to him, my voice barely more than a whisper. "What the hell was that?" "That," Sarah said, her voice shaking, "was our captor. He's the one who sets the rules. If you want to stay alive, you'll follow them to the letter." "But why?" I asked, desperation seeping into my voice. "Why is he doing this to us?" Ryan shook his head. "We don't know. We've been here for weeks, maybe months. The rules are all we have. If you follow them, he leaves you alone. But if you break them," he trailed off, his eyes filled with something that looked a lot like terror. "He enjoys it," Sarah added quietly, "punishing us. He never speaks, but he watches. He listens. It's like he's playing some kind of game." That night, I was led to a small, windowless room down a narrow, musty hallway. The walls were lined with cracked plaster, and the air was thick with a damp, moldy smell. There was a thin mattress on the floor, a bucket in the corner, and nothing else. The door clicked shut behind me, and I was plunged into darkness. I lay on the mattress, the paper with the rules clutched in my hands. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. Who was the masked man? What did he want with us? And why these strange, nonsensical rules? Sleep was impossible. Every creak, every whisper of movement beyond the door made my heart leap into my throat. I lay there, listening to the silence, my thoughts filled with the image of that cold, featureless mask. Sometime in the middle of the night, I heard it, a faint, distant sound. It was soft at first, almost like a lullaby, but as it grew louder, I recognized it as music. A slow, haunting melody that sent chills down my spine. Rule number 5. If you hear music playing, close your eyes immediately. I squeezed my eyes shut, my body trembling as the sound grew closer, the notes creeping under the door like a poisonous fog. The music wrapped around me, tightening its grip until I could barely breathe. I fought the urge to open my eyes, to see what was happening, but the memory of Ryan's warning kept me frozen in place. The music stopped abruptly, leaving behind a cold, suffocating silence. I stayed still, every muscle in my body tense, waiting for whatever horror came next. But after what felt like an eternity, I heard footsteps retreating, the sound fading into the distance. I exhaled shakily, my body drenched in sweat. I had no idea what would have happened if I'd broken that rule, and I had no desire to find out. The masked man was playing some kind of twisted game, and we were nothing but his pawns. As the darkness closed in around me, one thing became clear. If I was going to survive, I would need to play along. But deep down, I knew that sooner or later, something would force me to break the rules. And when that happened, I would be at the masked man's mercy. The next morning, I awoke to a harsh, buzzing sound echoing through the tiny room. It was relentless, shrill, like a fire alarm that didn't quite reach full volume but still drilled into my skull. I jolted upright on the thin mattress, my body stiff from a night of restless sleep. For a moment, I forgot where I was, expecting to be in my small, cramped apartment in Portland. Then the smell of damp concrete and the sight of the cracked plaster walls brought it all rushing back. I was a captive, kidnapped, trapped in some godforsaken place with two strangers and a masked psychopath. The door creaked open, and Ryan's face appeared in the doorway, his expression tight with concern. "Get up," he urged in a whisper. "Breakfast? Breakfast?" The word felt surreal in the context of everything that had happened, but I forced myself to move, my muscles protesting as I stumbled to my feet. I hadn't realized how weak I felt. How long had it been since I'd eaten? Ryan led me through a dimly lit hallway that smelled like mold and decay. The place was a maze of narrow corridors and hidden doors. It felt like a basement, but it was hard to tell. The only windows I'd seen were small slits high up on the walls, covered with grime that let in only the faintest hint of daylight. As we entered a larger room that served as a makeshift dining area, Sarah was already sitting there, her hands wrapped around a metal cup filled with water. There were no plates, no utensils, just a few bowls of something that looked like oatmeal, cold and lumpy, set on a rusty metal table. I sat down cautiously, my eyes darting around the room. Sarah barely acknowledged me, her eyes focused on the cup in her hands, while Ryan pushed a bowl of the grayish slop toward me. "It's not much," he muttered, "but it'll keep you from passing out." I stared at the bowl, my stomach turning at the sight of the lumpy mush. But hunger gnawed at me, and I forced myself to take a bite. It was tasteless, with the consistency of wet cardboard, but I swallowed it down, trying to ignore the queasiness rising in my throat. As we ate in silence, I noticed the tension between Ryan and Sarah. There was something unspoken between them, something that hinted at shared trauma. I wanted to ask them about it, to understand more about this nightmare we were trapped in, but the fear of the masked man's rules kept my mouth shut. Suddenly, the door at the far end of the room creaked open, and the masked man stepped inside. The room seemed to shrink, the air turning cold and heavy. I felt my pulse quicken, the rules Ryan had drilled into me echoing in my mind. Do not speak unless spoken to. The masked man was even more terrifying in the light. He was tall, his black clothing clinging to his lean frame like a second skin. The mask itself was featureless, like a smooth, expressionless face with no eyes, no mouth, no nose, just a blank slate staring back at me. His presence filled the room with a silent, suffocating dread. Sarah kept her eyes down, her hands shaking slightly as she gripped her cup. Ryan stayed perfectly still, his jaw clenched. I did the same, fighting the urge to look up, to see if the masked man was watching me. He didn't speak. He never did. He simply stood there, as if assessing us, waiting for one of us to slip up. I could feel his gaze on me, cold and unfeeling, like a predator watching its prey. Without warning, he turned and left the room, his heavy footsteps fading into the distance. The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving us in silence once more. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. What was that?" I whispered, breaking the tense silence. Ryan shot me a sharp look. "I told you, you don't speak unless spoken to. If he hears you." His voice trailed off, and I could see the fear in his eyes. Sarah was staring at the table, her face pale. It was clear they both knew something I didn't, something they were too afraid to share. He likes to observe, Sarah finally said, her voice barely more than a whisper. He watches us, listens to everything we say. That mask, it's not just to hide his face. What do you mean? I asked, leaning closer. It's like he sees everything, she continued, her eyes darting toward the door. Like he's reading your thoughts. One wrong move, one broken rule, and… She shuddered, unable to finish the sentence. Ryan leaned forward, his expression grim. The last person who spoke out of turn? He was taken. We heard him screaming for hours. When the masked man brought him back, he wasn't the same. He just sat there, staring at the wall. He wouldn't eat, wouldn't sleep. After 3 days, Ryan's voice broke, and he looked away. I didn't need him to finish. Whatever had happened to that person was enough to break him completely. The masked man was playing a game with us, and we were the pieces on his twisted board. Every rule, every order, was a test. A way to see how far he could push us before we broke. And I had the sickening feeling that this was just the beginning. The days blurred together into a haze of fear and monotony. We were given food twice a day, always the same tasteless slop, always eaten in silence under the masked man's watchful gaze. At night, we were herded back to our tiny rooms like animals, the heavy doors locking behind us. Sarah was right. The masked man was always watching. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of movement behind the walls, hear the faint hum of cameras hidden somewhere in the cracks. The sound of footsteps would echo through the hallways, even when no one was supposed to be there. One night, after a particularly long day of listening to Sarah and Ryan's whispered stories, I decided to test the boundaries. I stayed up past the midnight curfew, sitting by the door to see if anything would happen. For a long time, there was nothing but silence. Then, just as I was about to give up, I heard it. The faintest whisper of music. It was barely audible, like a ghostly melody drifting through the walls. My heart leapt into my throat as I remembered rule number 5. If you hear music playing, close your eyes immediately. I panicked, squeezing my eyes shut. But it was too late. The music grew louder, swelling to a crescendo that filled my mind, drowning out every other thought. I could feel something creeping toward my door, something dark and cold that sent shivers down my spine. When I opened my eyes, the music had stopped, but there was a new note slipped under my door. It was written in the same jagged, uneven handwriting as the list of rules. You broke the rule, it read. You will pay. The dread settled over me like a heavy cloak. I had crossed a line, and now I was marked. I didn't know what kind of punishment awaited me, but I could feel it looming over me like a shadow. Sarah and Ryan noticed the change in me the next day. I was jumpy, unable to focus, constantly looking over my shoulder. But I couldn't tell them what had happened. I didn't want to drag them into my mess. Then, that night, as I lay in bed, I heard it again. The music. This time, it was louder, clearer, as if it were being played right outside my door. My hands shook as I covered my ears, trying to block it out, but the melody seeped through, worming its way into my mind. And then, I heard a voice. Emily, open the door. It was Ryan's voice, soft and pleading, but I knew better. I knew he was in his room, just as I was in mine. The voice was a trick, a test to see if I'd break the rules again. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying for it to stop. The voice grew louder, more insistent, until it was almost a scream. But I didn't move. I didn't answer. And slowly, agonizingly, the voice faded away, leaving me in the dark, trembling with fear. I had passed this test, but deep down, I knew the masked man had many more waiting for me. The days turned into a grueling blur of monotony, fear, and sleepless nights. Ryan, Sarah, and I fell into a rhythm of silent meals, hushed conversations, and constant dread. The masked man's presence was relentless, his shadow always lurking just beyond the periphery of our vision. He never spoke, but his silence was more unnerving than any scream. Sarah kept warning me, "Don't do anything stupid, Emily. He's always watching." But the oppressive confinement, the claustrophobic walls, and the paranoia of being monitored 24/7 were getting to me. I needed to find a way out, something to cling to that might break this nightmare. It was during one of our silent dinners that I noticed Ryan was studying the cracked tiles on the floor, a look of concentration on his face. I leaned in closer, lowering my voice. "Ryan, what are you looking at?" "Shua," he whispered, barely moving his lips. "I've been keeping track of the footsteps. He always passes this room 3 times before he locks us in for the night." I didn't understand what he was getting at, but I could see a flicker of determination in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Ryan was planning something, and that night, when the masked man's heavy footsteps faded into the distance, Ryan quietly shared his plan with Sarah and me. "There's a door he uses to come and go. I've seen it, at the end of the hallway past the dining room. I think it leads outside." Sarah's eyes widened with a mix of fear and hope. "But what about the rules? What if we break one by trying to escape?" Ryan shook his head. "We can't just sit here and wait to die. We have to try something." Sarah was hesitant, and I could see the fear in her eyes. But I was desperate. The only thing worse than being trapped here was the thought of slowly losing my mind. I nodded, agreeing to Ryan's plan. We decided we'd try to escape the next night, during the masked man's patrol. That night, sleep was impossible. I kept listening for the faintest sound, every creak of the floorboards and whisper of the wind putting me on edge. Sarah, in the bed across the small room, was a trembling shadow in the darkness. We were both too afraid to speak, even in whispers. The next day dragged on like a slow, torturous march toward our planned escape. Ryan was tense, his eyes darting to the clock on the wall, waiting for the moment he would put his plan into action. As we sat in the dining area, the air was thick with tension. We barely touched our food. But then, the masked man entered. This time, he didn't just observe us from a distance. He walked directly toward me, his silent form filling my entire field of vision. The room seemed to grow colder as he approached. My pulse quickened. My mouth went dry. I tried to keep my eyes down, remembering the rule. He slid a note onto the table in front of me. The paper was crisp and clean, unlike the crumpled notes we had been given before. The message was simple, but the words sent a chill down my spine. "I know what you're planning. Don't try it." My heart sank. How could he possibly know? I hadn't told anyone besides Ryan and Sarah. I looked up, but the masked man had already turned away, gliding silently back to the shadows. Sarah shot me a terrified look, her face drained of color. Ryan clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. "We're doing it anyway," he whispered, his voice low and fierce. "He's just trying to scare us." But his words felt hollow. The fear had settled deep into my bones, and I could feel the masked man's unseen eyes watching us, waiting for us to make a mistake. Midnight came, and we were ready. Ryan had timed the patrols perfectly. He believed that the masked man would be far enough away for us to make it to the door undetected. As the third set of footsteps faded down the hallway, we slipped out of our rooms. The hallway was darker than usual, the weak overhead lights flickering as if the electricity was struggling to stay alive. The air was thick with dust, and each breath felt heavy in my lungs. Ryan took the lead, with Sarah and I close behind. We moved as silently as we could, our footsteps muffled by the cold, damp floor. We reached the end of the hallway, where Ryan swore there was a door. But as he reached for the handle, a sharp, sudden burst of music filled the air. The haunting melody was the same one I had heard before, the one that nearly drove me mad. My instinct was to close my eyes, but Ryan was panicking, tugging on the door that wouldn't budge. "Emily, Sarah, close your eyes." I screamed, squeezing my own eyes shut as the music intensified, its twisted melody filling every corner of my mind. But it was too late. I heard Sarah's scream, a high-pitched, agonized sound that was abruptly cut off. The door behind us slammed shut, and everything went dark. After our failed attempt to escape, the air in the house changed. It felt colder, heavier, and more oppressive. I was alone in my room again, but it no longer felt like a temporary prison. It felt like a tomb, slowly closing in on me. Ryan was gone. Sarah was nowhere to be found, and I was left to grapple with the terror that gnawed at me from the inside out. Sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I would see Ryan's horrified expression, the masked figures dragging him away. The darkness was no longer just an absence of light. It was a living thing, pressing against me, whispering my name in voices that sounded both familiar and foreign. 3 nights after our escape attempt, the whispers started to change. They no longer came from behind the walls. Instead, they echoed inside my mind, like thoughts that were not my own. "Emily, open your eyes. I know you can hear me." I jolted awake, my eyes snapping open. My room was pitch black, but I could feel a presence standing near my bed. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. I squeezed my eyes shut again, remembering rule number 5. If you hear music playing, close your eyes immediately. But there was no music this time, just the relentless whispering. "Emily, don't you want to know what happened to your friends?" The voice was soft, almost gentle, but laced with malice. I clutched the thin blanket around me, trying to block out the sound, but it felt like it was crawling into my skull. I fought the urge to open my eyes, to face whatever was standing there, but the fear of what I might see kept me paralyzed. Eventually, the voice faded, and the oppressive weight lifted. I was drenched in sweat, my heart racing. I realized then that the masked man was no longer content to watch from the shadows. He was escalating, pushing me closer to the edge, trying to break me. I didn't know why, but I could feel it. The rules were changing, becoming more twisted, more dangerous. Sarah returned to our shared dining area 2 days later. Her face was gaunt, her eyes hollow. She wouldn't meet my gaze, and I knew she had been punished for our escape attempt. But when I tried to speak to her, she shook her head violently, her lips trembling. "They're watching," she whispered, glancing around the room. "They're always watching." I pressed her for answers, but she clammed up, her eyes darting to the corners of the room as if expecting to see one of the masked figures lurking there. She was right to be paranoid. The faint hum of hidden cameras had become a constant presence. I could feel their cold, mechanical eyes following my every move. That night, I lay awake, my mind racing. I kept replaying our failed escape attempt, trying to understand where we had gone wrong. Ryan had been so sure of his plan, but it was as if the masked man had known every step we were going to take. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. We were never alone. The masked man had been listening, watching, and manipulating us all along. Every conversation, every plan. He had known about it before we even acted. As I lay there, trying to piece together how we had been so thoroughly deceived, I heard it again. The faint, ghostly sound of music. This time, it was a child's lullaby, slow and haunting. I felt the same cold dread wash over me, but I didn't close my eyes. I couldn't. I had to know where it was coming from. I crept to the door, pressing my ear against it. The music was louder now, as if it was playing just beyond the threshold. My heart pounded in my chest, my hands trembling. I couldn't tell if it was real or just another twisted game. Then, the door creaked open on its own, revealing a long, dark hallway that hadn't been there before. I hesitated for a long moment, the dark corridor before me seeming to pulse with its own malevolent energy. The music was louder now, filling the space around me with a slow, taunting melody that felt like it was crawling under my skin. I stepped into the hallway, my feet moving of their own accord. The air was thick, and every breath tasted of mildew and rot. My heart was pounding, but there was a strange, almost hypnotic pull that kept me moving forward. As I reached the end of the corridor, I came to a heavy door marked with a red symbol. Rule number 4, never touch the door with the red mark. The rule flashed in my mind, but I was beyond caring. I needed answers. With a trembling hand, I pushed the door open. Inside was a room filled with screens. Old CRT monitors stacked haphazardly, wires snaking across the floor like black veins. On each screen was a different angle of the house, footage of every room, every hallway, every dark corner. My stomach twisted as I realized that every moment we'd spent here had been recorded. Our suffering had been watched, analyzed, enjoyed. But that wasn't the worst of it. In the center of the room was a table covered in photographs. My hands shook as I picked one up. It was a picture of me, taken through the window of my apartment back in Portland. There were more. Photos of Ryan, Sarah, even the faces of people I didn't recognize. Each one was labeled with dates and notes scribbled in red ink. The masked man had been watching us long before we were taken. As I rifled through the papers, a sickening dread filled my gut. These weren't just random victims. The masked man had chosen us for a reason. But why? What do we all have in common? My eyes landed on a newspaper clipping pinned to the wall. It was an article about a fire in New York City 5 years ago. As I scanned the article, my blood ran cold. The names listed as victims. I recognized one of them. It was my old college roommate, someone I hadn't thought about in years. That's when it clicked. The masked man was connected to my past, to the secrets I had tried to leave behind. This wasn't just a random kidnapping. This was personal. Before I could process what I had discovered, the door behind me slammed shut and the room plunged into darkness. A single monitor flickered to life, and on the screen was a live feed of Sarah, bound to a chair, her eyes wide with terror. The masked man's voice crackled through the speakers for the first time. "Emily, you've been a bad girl. Now you must choose, Sarah's life or your own." My hands shook as I watched the live feed. The masked man's voice was cold, devoid of any emotion, like a machine programmed to inflict pain. Sarah was crying, her muffled sobs filling the room through the speakers. My mind raced. I had to do something. But what? I was trapped, alone, with no weapons and no plan. "Make your choice," the masked man repeated, his voice dripping with cruel amusement. "Will you save her, or will you save yourself?" "I can't," I stammered, my voice cracking. "I can't do this." But the masked man wasn't interested in my protests. The screen flickered, showing a countdown timer, 60 seconds. If I didn't act, Sarah would die. Desperation took over. I tore through the papers on the table, searching for anything that might help me. Then I found it, a blueprint of the house with a series of hidden passages marked in red. I had seen one of these passages earlier, just outside the surveillance room. I sprinted through the darkened corridors, my heart pounding as the seconds ticked away. I reached the hidden door, praying that I could reach Sarah in time. Bursting into the room, I found Sarah bound to a chair, her eyes wide with terror. The masked man stood behind her, his knife glinting in the dim light. "Let her go!" I screamed, my voice raw with desperation. The masked man tilted his head, as if considering my demand. "You think you can bargain with me, Emily?" he whispered. "You think you have control?" But before he could strike, I lunged at him, adrenaline surging through me. The knife clattered to the floor, and I tackled him, struggling to tear off his mask. For a moment, I saw his face, a face I recognized from my past, a face I had tried so hard to forget. But it was all a distraction. The masked man kicked me off, grabbing his knife again. Before he could strike, a gunshot echoed through the room. Sarah had managed to free herself and found a hidden revolver in one of the drawers. The masked man crumpled to the floor, blood pooling around him. The masked man's body lay crumpled on the cold concrete floor, the revolver still smoking in Sarah's trembling hands. I couldn't believe what had just happened. The oppressive silence that had filled the room after the gunshot was shattered by the sound of Sarah's ragged breaths. Blood was pooling around the masked man's head, a dark stain spreading out like ink. Sarah was shaking, her eyes wide and unfocused, the revolver slipping from her fingers. I reached out to steady her, but she flinched away, her eyes darting between me and the lifeless body on the ground. Is it over?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I wanted to say yes, but I couldn't. There was something about this whole nightmare that still didn't make sense. The masked man's chilling whisper still echoed in my mind. "You think you have control?" I knelt down beside the body, hesitating before reaching out to remove the mask completely. My hands shook as I peeled it off, revealing a face twisted in a permanent grimace, his lifeless eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. But I didn't recognize him. This wasn't someone from my past. It was a stranger. My heart sank. All this time, I had thought this was personal, that he was targeting me for a reason. But now I was more confused than ever. Sarah let out a choked sob. "Emily, what do we do now? How do we get out of here?" I tried to steady my breathing, forcing myself to think. We need to find an exit. He must have had a way to get in and out of here. I searched the surveillance room, hoping to find a clue, anything that could explain what had just happened. But as I scoured through the blueprints and papers strewn across the desk, I found something that made my blood run cold. A folder with Sarah's name on it. I glanced at her, but she was staring at the ground, lost in her thoughts. With shaking hands, I opened the folder. Inside were photographs, pictures of Sarah taken over the past year. They showed her at work, at her apartment, even at a park I recognized in downtown Portland. And there were notes, detailed observations written in the same jagged handwriting I'd seen on the rules. But what was more disturbing was a note dated just days before we were all taken. Sarah is becoming unreliable. May need to adjust her role in the game. My stomach churned. What did this mean? Sarah had been here longer than I had. She had warned me about the rules, about the masked man's sadistic games. But what if she knew more than she was letting on? Sarah, I said slowly, my voice barely more than a whisper. How long have you really been here? Her head snapped up, and for a moment, there was something in her eyes that sent a chill down my spine. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by the same look of fear and desperation. I don't know, she stammered, but her voice wavered. It feels like weeks, maybe months. I wasn't convinced. But before I could press her further, the monitors flickered to life, one by one. The screens filled with static, then the familiar image of the masked man appeared. Alive and well, staring directly into the camera, my blood turned to ice. How? I gasped, staring at the monitors in disbelief. The man Sarah had shot was still lying on the floor in a pool of blood, but here he was again, on the screens, looking as real as ever. The masked figure tilted his head, as if amused by my confusion. Did you really think it would be that easy? His voice crackled through the speakers, cold and mocking. I've had my fun, but now it's time for the final act. The room's lights flickered, and then, with a deafening crash, the door to the surveillance room slammed shut, trapping Sarah and me inside. Sarah's face went pale as the door sealed with a heavy, metallic clang. We were trapped. The masked man's laughter echoed through the speakers, a sound so cold and hollow that it sent shivers racing down my spine. I turned to Sarah, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. The man we had killed was dead, yet his voice still taunted us. Sarah, what the hell is going on? I demanded, my voice rising with panic. What aren't you telling me? Tears welled up in her eyes, but she didn't answer. She just stared at the monitors, where the masked man's cold, unblinking eyes seemed to pierce right through us. You were supposed to follow the rules, Emily, the masked man's voice hissed. But now, the rules have changed. Suddenly, the walls began to close in, grinding with a deep, mechanical groan. The floor beneath us vibrated, and the air was filled with the sound of gears turning. My pulse spiked, adrenaline surging through my veins. We had to get out now. I grabbed Sarah's arm and yanked her toward the surveillance desk. There has to be a way to override the system, I said, scanning the monitors for any clue. But the screens were filled with static, and every button I pressed seemed to do nothing. As the walls crept closer, I caught a glimpse of a blinking red light beneath the desk. I reached down, finding a hidden panel. My fingers brushed over a set of buttons and a small lever. Help me, I shouted to Sarah, who was frozen in fear. We can't just stand here. But instead of helping, Sarah took a step back, her eyes wide with terror. I'm sorry, Emily, she whispered. I didn't know it would go this far. What are you talking about? I demanded, but there was no time. The walls were now inches from us, the grinding sound nearly deafening. I pulled the lever, and a hatch in the floor opened with a loud hiss. Without a second thought, I jumped in, landing hard on a metal grate below. I looked up, expecting Sarah to follow, but she was still standing there, frozen in place. Sarah, come on, I screamed, but she shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I can't, she whispered. I made a deal. Before I could process her words, the hatch above me slammed shut, plunging me into darkness. I stumbled through the narrow tunnel, my heart pounding in my ears. The sound of the walls closing in on Sarah echoed behind me, followed by her scream. A scream that cut off abruptly. I pushed forward, tears blurring my vision. I had trusted Sarah, and now she was gone, just like Ryan. I was alone again, racing through the dark passageway, not knowing where it would lead. The tunnel opened up into a vast, underground chamber. There, at the center, was another figure in a mask. But this one was different, more ornate, with gold trim and hollow, soulless eyes. I knew then that the man we had killed was only a pawn. The real mastermind had been watching us the whole time, orchestrating everything from behind the scenes. "Welcome, Emily," the masked figure said, his voice a twisted echo that filled the chamber. "You've proven yourself resilient, but now you must play my game alone." I backed away, my mind racing. There was no way out. The masked figure took a step forward, and the lights flickered, revealing the bodies of previous captives hanging from the ceiling like grotesque trophies. "Your friends are gone," he continued, "but you have potential." I was cornered. There was no escape, no hope. The masked figure reached for me, his fingers like cold steel, and I realized in that moment that this was always meant to be my end. But just as his hand closed around my throat, I remembered the revolver I had tucked into my waistband. In one swift motion, I pulled it out and fired. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. The masked figure staggered back, clutching his chest. For a moment, I thought I had one. But then, slowly, he started to laugh, a deep, guttural sound that echoed off the walls. His body dissolved into shadows, leaving nothing behind but the sound of his laughter. As the darkness closed in around me, I realized that this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The masked man had marked me, and no matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, he would always be there, waiting, watching, ready to play his game again. A week later, in a quiet suburb, a young woman in her 20s opened her front door to find a black envelope on her doorstep. Inside was a list of rules, written in the same jagged handwriting. Rule number 1, never scream, and thus, the game begins again.